Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. We're going to have a brief conversation about the Inflation Reduction Act and what it means to the construction industry. I'm Tony Ullman, a partner here at Baker Tilly, and joining me today is Laura Cataldo, director in our construction and real estate consulting practice. Laura, I want to talk a little bit about what we're going to cover this afternoon.
Great. Thank you, Tony. We appreciate everyone joining us for this conversation today, which is certainly timely as guidance from Treasury on the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements is publishing today in the Federal Register. This brief webinar will cover the fundamentals of the Inflation Reduction Act and what you as a contractor should know. The bonus credits are linked to prevailing wage and apprenticeship and the use of domestic content, all of which are predominantly the responsibility of the contractor. We will close with recommendations on next steps and how to prepare for these requirements. We don't think that time will allow for live Q&A, but if you do have questions, please put them in the chat box and we can follow up on those after the webinar. The White House press releases promoting the Inflation Reduction Act highlight the goals of lowering healthcare costs for families, making the tax code fairer, and combating the climate crisis. The climate crisis provisions of lowering energy costs, building a clean energy economy, and reducing harmful pollution all include funds that create opportunities for the construction industry. This is just a graphical overview of how that $499 billion is allocated. There are over 70 separate tax credits in the IRA that are linked to the clean energy goals. Many of these are entitlement credits, meaning tax credits that are awarded over a defined period of time. The Inflation Reduction Act is unique in that most of the tax credits are good through 2032. 10 years is much longer than other previous energy policies. And this act also incorporated elements from the USDA and the Department of Energy loan programs that can provide direct low interest loans to help with funding for qualified projects. And while the Inflation Reduction Act was passed in August of this year, the provisions are retroactive to January 1 of 2022. Existing and new credits with the bonus criteria that we'll be reviewing today apply in 23 and 24, and then expand to include the transition to CO2 emissions-based provisions through 2030 and beyond. Without getting into the nuts and bolts of each tax credit, the overarching goal of the clean energy provisions is to reduce carbon emissions. The White House promised that this act is delivering on President Biden's promise of growing the economy by taking aggressive action on tackling the climate crisis, lifting up American workers, and creating good-paying jobs. It is also unique in that there is an option to transfer the credits, and some entities can receive direct payments in lieu of tax credits.
So let's talk briefly about the types of credits that are available and some of the new bonus features that have emerged from this piece of legislation. Historically, we've seen different kinds of credits for combined heat and power. Certainly, many of us have seen the opportunities available with solar, biodiesel, carbon capture, as well as renewable fuels. And as we drive around the country today, we see the wind farms that have gone up over the last 10 years. Many of these credits had been expiring and have now been extended. Additionally, we now have new credits with bonus features. For programs that have different aspects of manufacturing, different kinds of qualifying biogas product, storage programs, sustainable aviation fuels, clean hydrogen, zero emission. In a broad sense, in some ways, we're talking reducing carbon footprint, organizations that are driving strategy to reduce their carbon footprint, reduce their energy usage, and in an overall manner, improve their energy usage as well as reduce their cost of operations. So what is meant by a credit? Typically, when we think about tax credits, this is a dollar for dollar offset against your tax liability. We'd all like to see our tax liabilities reduced, and these tax credits can allow for that. However, not every organization has a tax liability, and in those cases, there is an opportunity to transfer these credits to a third party. Sometimes these credits are referred to as selling credits on the open market. This is a practice that's been done with historic tax credits and other forms of credits that have been made available to program developers over the years. What's truly unique and really exciting is now there is also a direct payment program available. Historically, tax credits have not been terribly beneficial to not-for-profits, governments, charities, and the kind of organizations that don't normally have to submit a tax return. However, the program now has an allowable benefit that these organizations can receive a direct pay from the federal government. What we're showing you here is how the tax credits can be compounded together. As each credit has a base level of qualifying energy costs and credit that is associated with it, and as each requirement is met, the use of prevailing wage, domestic content, energy community, the credits begin to be compounded. The opportunity here is to significantly reduce the investment required to achieve much more efficient energy and renewable energy opportunities. So as a contractor, what do we need to know? Laura alluded at the beginning of our presentation that contractors are going to bear a lot of responsibility to the documentation that's going to be required to be compliant under this program. So we're going to talk a little bit this afternoon about prevailing wage, the apprenticeship requirements, domestic content, or what's commonly referred to as Buy American, and project cost certification. Beginning with domestic content. The domestic content or Buy American requirements have been around for more than 20 years. Domestic content generally is referred to as product that has been manufactured within the United States. As we think about it in terms of major construction projects, it could be the control system, it may be the elevators, it might be the chillers that go with your HVAC. We have a continually increasing domestic content requirement. Projects that are underway are going to be expected to have a 40% domestic content requirement, increasing to 45% in 2025, 50% in 26, and after January 1st, 2027, a 55% domestic requirement. Furthermore, we have a 100% steel and iron requirement. Therefore, the steel and iron that is being used in the construction project, as well as the manufacturing of the major components, are expected to be 100% U.S. sourced. Now, let's talk a little bit about what that means. Under the Buy American Act, which is what we are using for today's definition, the Buy American Act defines over 20 countries that are U.S. steel source equivalents. So, if you have a major piece of equipment that has been manufactured in Germany, and Germany is one of the BAA equivalents, that is a steel equivalent to having been sourced here in the United States. Therefore, it is necessary to be tracking your cost and tracking your sources based on not only who your vendors are, but what your supply chain looks like throughout the entire process.
Great, thanks, Tony. So one of the other major provisions is the requirement for prevailing wage. In order to qualify for that bonus 30% credit, there is a requirement to pay prevailing wage to any work that's being performed on the construction, alteration, or repair of an eligible facility. Now, prevailing wages are based on the hourly rate of wages and benefits that are paid to a number of similarly employed workers in a given geography. If you've worked on federal construction projects, prevailing wages are required under Davis-Bacon, and the agency provided monitoring of the compliance. What's unique? But prevailing wages are required. One thing that came out in the clarification today is that prevailing wages are required for both employees and independent contractors that are performing work. The prevailing wage requirement is met by paying the wage and complying with the general record keeping requirements that include maintaining records that document the applicable wage determination, the employees who performed the work, the classifications of work that they performed, the hours that they worked in each classification, and the wage rates that were paid for the work. Failure to pay the prevailing wage can be met if employers paid back pay, plus interest, and a penalty of $5,000 per worker. That amount can go up to $10,000 per worker for intentional disregard. Under guidance that's publishing today, the Department of Labor has not published if the Department of Labor has not published a prevailing wage determination, or if there are not wages published for all of the wages, the taxpayer is responsible for contacting the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division to request that a wage determination may be made. So there have been quite a few questions that have come our way from facility owners about prevailing wage. And it's important for contractors to understand this, as this can be really a selling point or an advantage for you so that you know how to answer questions. Questions such as, will prevailing wage increase our construction costs? And will prevailing wages increase the cost for both union and non-union contractors? A few points about prevailing wage. Prevailing wage is currently something that union contractors are typically meeting and paying, and many non-union contractors are as well. So it's not necessarily a given that construction costs will go up because prevailing wage is put in place. And we have some data here for your use on, the percentage of construction costs that are labor related and what that would really mean to overall construction cost. So, in addition to the prevailing wage, there is a requirement that contractors meet apprenticeship requirements. Now, prevailing wage is something that many contractors were accustomed to using for federal projects. The apprenticeship requirements are a totally new territory and are directly in line with President Biden's goal of creating new jobs. If an employer has 4 or more employees or independent contractors performing work on the construction, alteration, or repair of a project seeking these energy credits, the apprenticeship requirements must be met. A percentage of the total labor hours, 10% if construction begins before January 1 of 23. After that, it's 12.5% of labor hours. And beginning in 2024, it's 15% of labor hours must be completed by a qualified apprentice. And so it's important to understand the definition of what a qualified apprentice is. Qualified apprentice is an apprentice that is participating in a registered apprenticeship program. And a registered apprenticeship program meets the following criteria. There's paid work that's paid on an incremental wage schedule based on experience and skill. That there's on-the-job training that is defined with a minimum of 2,000 hours or 1 year of work. That there's classroom instruction with a minimum of 144 hours per year. That there's a recommended 1-to-1 ratio of supervision. And importantly, that it is credentialed by the Department of Labor or state agency. So if you have maybe an informal apprenticeship program in place within your company, but it is not recognized by the Department of Labor or recognized by your state, you will not qualify as a registered apprenticeship program and will not be able to claim the qualified apprenticeship requirement. So a few kind of clarifications on this that owners may be asking you, are ways that you can differentiate yourselves. Union apprenticeship programs are all registered. So if you are a union contractor training through the labor union, you do have a registered apprenticeship program. Some non-union apprenticeships are also registered, some but not all. So if you do participate in a registered apprenticeship program, this is an important fact to promote to owners that are going to be seeking this credit. And if you do not participate in a registered apprenticeship program and are seeking to work on projects seeking these credits, I do recommend that you act quickly to find a program to partner with. There are many different resources that we can connect you with, so please feel free to reach out with questions on that. So it is interesting that the apprenticeship requirements are so stringent, but there's a lot of wiggle room with the actual adherence that we were frankly somewhat surprised that there wasn't a little more guidance given on it in what's being released today. So if you do not have the required number of apprentices, you need to request apprentices from a registered program. If the request is denied because there are no apprentices available for you, or if the apprenticeship program does not reply to your request within 5 days, you have satisfied the requirements. Now, if you are short on the number of apprentice hours, you can pay a penalty of $500 per hour for each hour short of the requirement. However, if the Department of Labor Secretary determines that this shortage was intentional, this penalty can escalate to $5,000 per hour. We do not know the definition of intentional disregard at this time and hope that that will be coming sometime in the future. A few roles you do not need to include are foreman, superintendent, business owners, executives, administrative or professional roles. Many of those are not apprenticeable positions anyway. But it's important to remember that this requirement does apply to both employees and independent contractors that are performing work on the construction, alteration, or repair of the facility.
So now that we've gained a further understanding of what the requirements are, now becomes the opportunity and the need for certifying our project costs and documenting our compliance. So for the owner developer to fully realize the benefit of the credits, they will need to be providing independent documentation verifying their costs incurred. I want to emphasize here again, this is the owner's cost. So contractors, you need to be sure that you do not need to expose your cost structure in order to provide cost certification. So these are the owner's costs that must be certified. The construction cost incurred must be comprised at least 60% US-based cost, with increasing requirements to 65% in 24 and 75% in 29. So what will contractors need to provide? Well, for one, prevailing wage reports. As Laura had mentioned, most contractors are really quite familiar with prevailing wage requirements, and providing certified payroll reports is a common practice with many contractors. As it gets a little bit more challenging, workforce reports documenting qualified apprentice hours on the project. We all hope that as further guidance comes out, we will see better definition on exactly what a workforce report is expected to look like. But in all fairness, it should likely follow the guidelines that we see with prevailing wage. Once we move past our labor requirements, we also have to look at our supply chain and our domestic content requirement. So we'll be looking for supplier letters certifying the construction materials were sourced here in the country. So that means contractors, you need to be working with your supply chain in order to help determine if that content is actually going to be complied with. Supplier letters certifying installed equipment meets domestic content. So it's not just enough that the materials that you've used for the source of construction have been sourced properly, but the equipment is also being sourced and meets the manufacturing requirements of the ever increasing 40 to 45%, as well as then signed letters certifying that your project labor was performed in the US. This part is actually going to be fairly easy to comply with since most on-site construction is going to be US-based labor. However, as we see different kinds of construction methods, as we see more modular construction, it may be possible that modular construction is offshored and may not necessarily meet the cost certification requirements. Lastly, owner billing allocation. So contractors, we need you to work with that schedule of values and properly allocate the billings across your direct labor, the direct materials, and the installed equipment. I want to emphasize the importance here is that we're not looking at your individual cost. We are looking at the owner's cost. However, it will be critical that we have clear understanding of how those costs have been allocated across each of the different schedules of value. So let's talk about begun construction because this is one of the safe harbor areas. Projects that have been started in 2022 that are going to be put into operation potentially in 23 or 24. So our first area is what's called the physical work test. Has enough work been performed at the job site to legitimately say the project is fully underway? Or we have what's called the 5% safe harbor, which is that at least minimally 5% of the overall depreciable project costs have been incurred by the owner. Once construction has been met, the project must continue to stay in construction. So it's not enough to have a boost of activity in order to meet the begun construction requirements, but it must continue and stay under construction. Each project will have its own set of facts and circumstances that will drive the begun construction strategy. Um, but let's talk a little bit about what is not going to help qualify here. A number of questions have come up over the last few months about, well, does this meet physical work activities? Planning and design, financing, permitting, surveying, engineering, studies, site clearing. None of these activities qualify as physical completed work. So let's talk a little bit about 5% safe harbor. As I'd said, the owner must incur 5% or more of the total cost of the facility. So contractors, it's not 5% of your cost, it is 5% of the overall project cost. So if there are multiple vendors involved, in order to meet the 5% safe harbor, it must include the 5% of all of those vendors that are billing for the project, not just the prime. Secondly, qualifying cost. All the cost must be properly included in the depreciable basis of the facility. If there are components that are not going to be depreciable, if they are not going to be capitalized as part of that project cost, they will not qualify for your 5% safe harbor. Lastly, meeting the 5% safe harbor allows you to bypass the physical requirements. So projects that have begun construction will be exempt from the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, assuming they have begun construction within 59 days of the legislative guidance being released. The official release date is today, November 30th, 2022.
So with this guidance that's coming out, there's still a number of areas that we're hoping will be clarified over time. For example, what is the timeline set for the Department of Labor to respond to wage determination requests? What happens if an apprentice completes their 2 to 4 year apprenticeship program during the course of construction? And how do multi-craft contractors meet the apprenticeship guidelines? Is it based on total labor hours or per trade? And in regards to prevailing wage, apprenticeship, and materials, how far down the chain do the requirements go? Second tier, third tier, and beyond? And it's also not clear how the payment of prevailing wage can be applied for the entire duration of the tax credit once construction is complete. Is the facility owner then required to pay prevailing wage? And as it relates to compliance and penalty, there's a lot of gray, including the definition of intentional disregard that results in that tenfold increase. We're hoping to seek additional guidance on those as industry groups are documenting these questions and putting them forward. So there will likely be more to come on these updates.
However, the legislation is live and the opportunities today are real. Therefore, contractors, we have a couple of recommendations for you. Evaluate your project landscape for projects that involve energy efficiency, renewable energy, or other eligible components under the Act. Reach out to your project owners. Talk to them that maybe projects that have been in the pipeline, but they didn't have the financial legs to get started today. But now with a tax credit, that's just enough additional capital to make your project go. Pre-qualify your company as meeting the requirements for the bonus credits. Actively promote the fact that you can meet prevailing wage, that you are working with trade and craft contractors that have qualified apprentices, that you have a qualified supply chain that meets the domestic content requirements. Because contractors that can promote a full package to an owner are certainly going to be looked upon far more favorably than those that are coming back with the answers, well, we're going to work on that. You may want to consider putting a development plan in place for those who wish to move forward, conducting activities now to help preserve credits and optimize value. And understand the begun construction means in practice, determining if a project is needed sooner rather than later in order to minimize future burden. Lastly, if your project is underway, assess the options to defer or modify the completion to see if there's opportunities to have the Act pay for those modifications. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. We look forward to cataloging your questions and getting back to each of you in the very near future.